Hi there. Thanks for joining us here in Harris Hall, the History Department at Northwestern University. I'm Robin Bates, and today I'm here with Professor Edward Westermann. Professor Westermann is a Regents Professor Emeritus of History and a Piper Professor of 2023 at Texas A&M University San Antonio. But to our great good fortune, he is also this spring quarter of 2026 the Theodore Zev and Alice R. Weiss Holocaust Educational Foundation Chair in Holocaust Studies here at Northwestern University. Thanks for joining us, Ed. How are you?
Well, thanks, Robin. No, I'm delighted to be here.
Ed, you are the Holocaust Education Foundation Chair in Holocaust Studies because, of course, you have this formidable and ever-growing body of scholarship, but you also have a personal association with the foundation going back many years. And if I could just invite you, how did you start working with the Holocaust Education Foundation, and how did you get into the study of Holocaust studies in general?
Well, Robin, I wouldn't have near the background or the scholarship that I have if it wasn't for Zev Weiss. And I met Zev back in 1993, and he was attempting to establish programs across the United States by recruiting professors and history departments and English departments to establish courses on the Holocaust. And he had approached the department head at the Air Force Academy, where I was coming back to after studying the German police at Florida State for a master's degree. And it turned out that I had the good fortune of co-teaching the first offering of the Holocaust course at the Air Force Academy for our cadets there. And that turned into a relationship. Not only did Zev help us with the course and the development, but also me personally with a trip to Eastern Europe, along with another group of scholars who are all senior PhDs. I mean, I was quite fortunate to join that group. Peter Hayes was among that group. And just we spent about 2 weeks in an atmosphere where I think that was the greatest seminar I ever had. But also listening to Zev discuss his own experience at Auschwitz as his return for the very first time to Auschwitz after his liberation was a very powerful moment. And throughout my career, subsequently, when I got my PhD, Zev was someone who was very a close friend, a mentor, and someone who was an inspiration to my continued study of the Holocaust. So Zev and Alice having the opportunity to have this chair is something that I really value in many ways, not only because it's Northwestern and the reputation that the history department here has, but also because I would not be here if it wasn't for Zev. And it's a way for me to kind of honor him and honor his memory and to be here with these great students that we have.
Yeah, I mean, we are so fortunate that you could be here to teach our students this quarter. You have two courses. You have a course on military history at the graduate level, and then you have a course on Holocaust history for our undergrads. And let me just ask, what's it been like to teach our students?
Well, I love my students at Texas A&M San Antonio. They were a great group and really interested in the topics. They were a pleasure to teach. And one of the things I always talked about for a majority minority institution was there's a sense of community on the campus and in the classroom. And for me as an educator, trying to establish that sense of community as to being a group involved in kind of this academic journey together. I was uncertain at how that would actually play out at Northwestern, and it's been really it has exceeded my expectations. These are smart young men and women who work hard, who think deeply, who are very reflective and committed to the topics that we're exploring. So it's really been for me kind of a pleasure to be in that classroom, especially since I had retired about a year ago, and it's been a year since I've been in the classroom. So I was in a little bit of classroom withdrawal. So it was nice to get back in there with students again and to kind of share that dialogue, to kind of share that journey and build that community of learning that I think really makes us as instructors better, but obviously, hopefully, also our students wiser in the process.
So last week, in fact, I saw and met a bunch of your students because they came to a talk that you gave here in Harris 108 in the Leopold Room, talk titled "Thirst is Dreadful, Worse Than Hunger, Dehydration, Despair, and Death in the Holocaust." And I think maybe a dozen students must have asked you questions out of the audience. And in fact, I felt a bit like a student myself because you were displaying a number of quotes as part of your presentation from memoirs that I had thought that I had read and maybe understood a little bit, but in fact, I realized that I had not taken on board what I'd been reading, that you were making us focus on thirst as a particular theme and experience and structuring aspect of the lager, of the concentration camp. And I'm wondering what has inspired you to pursue this research direction. I mean, I understand that it's going to come out as an article with Yad Vashem Studies in good time. Um, and what it is you think that we learn about the Holocaust in general by centering this theme.
Well, one of the things that always amazes me about the kind of the privilege we have as historians is sometimes we think, you know, topics that have been looked at, the Holocaust for over 80 years and scholarship, for example, we kind of think, well, maybe the topics are pretty much dried up. Maybe there's not anything new to be written about. And then as depending on what methodologies we use, what frame of reference, whose frame of reference we use, we come up with new questions and also new research. And in the case of thirst and dehydration, I was like you. Many of these sources I have read multiple times with my students over the course of decades. And it took, you know, I say Cleo whispering in my ear, getting the muse a little bit to say, I had taken books and I always write marginal notes. So I deface my books. They're mine. I own them. Not library books. I never do that. But I had come to the realization that I had written down water and thirst quite a bit. And we talk a lot about hunger and starvation. That tends to be a default in disease when we're talking about the camps, especially. And what became apparent to me as I kind of started expanding into medical literature that looked at the role of dehydration. And this is, I think, one of being maybe a more mature scholar. Uh, we start to look at sources in ways from the social sciences, for example, when I looked at alcohol earlier. But now water really pushed me in the area of medical sciences to think about what dehydration was like, when it started. Also, it has physiological effects, but it has cognitive and psychological effects, just like severe hunger or starvation do. And as I was going through that medical literature, then it became clear to me that it's not a binary simply between starvation and dehydration, that in fact they work together and they can be synergistic. And that was something that I thought was extremely important. Again, looking not only at physiological effects, but cognitive and psychological effects that come from that kind of confluence of both of those things together. And then the more I thought about these prisoners who are talking about water and the need for water and thirst, was things like, well, waterborne disease and its implications, not only in the camps, but in the ghettos, for example, we see that. Hygiene and the lack of hygiene that's also tied to the lack of clean water or the availability of water, and what that means, not only in a sense of disease, but just thinking in practical terms about people who can't wash, can't keep themselves clean. And then we start looking at some of the mental health literature about this bidirectional kind of relationship between mental health and physical personal hygiene, and how that can go in both directions, right? So that kind of was another way of looking at this topic. And then toxic sources of water. So some of the most horrific kind of choiceless choices that people who are in a state of severe dehydration had to face, and they talk about it, those who survived, these kind of toxic puddles and what it meant to drink from those sources or from polluted sources or sources where bacteria was in,
Mm.
and then getting dysentery, which means then diarrhea, which means then losing water at a great rate and not being able to replace it or to clean oneself. And so as I was the further I got in to thinking about this, it was very clear to me that this was a topic that had been, again, kind of like alcohol use, but maybe even more so, hiding in plain sight. That there was a lot to this topic that could be explored. And one of the areas to me that was also of interest is we have this idea of the so-called Musulmana, these guys who, men and women who had essentially described by prisoners and survivors as those who had become completely apathetic, had given up hope, had stopped trying, in some cases, go to the wire and touch the wire to end their lives. Well, what was clear to me also is that psychological state of delirium, madness, that severe dehydration and starvation together can form, was that, again, we have another potential way of looking at this widespread phenomenon that occurred. And it was also a case of thinking about how age, gender, and state of health, there's disparities in the way in which individuals experience dehydration and starvation, thirst and hunger based on those factors. So thinking about that. And kind of a final thing that is going to be unanswerable, but this idea of we know that electrolyte imbalance, chronic dehydration, leads to advanced acute kidney disease and chronic kidney disease, and also heart issues, the absence of potassium, for example. Hypoalkalemia, as people talk about it, hyponatremia or hyponatremia, meaning with sodium, excess sodium in that case. But that these things, we don't think about that, how individuals who did survive, though, survived with damage to their organs that over time, maybe in some cases, literally months, maybe years, maybe even decades, but that had put them in a situation, a health situation, where their long term survival would be at risk by what they experienced as a result of these camp conditions. And that's an unknowable in a certain respect, that's an unknowable statistic, but I think as a historian, it's one we should appreciate.
The magnitude of what happened is such that we are still coming to grips with understanding it in its complexity. And this is something that's come home to me again as I've looked at this new avenue of research you're pursuing. Also, I had the same experience last year because you gave a talk. You've alluded to this, so I want to draw you out on alcohol use and perpetrators in the Holocaust. And this is a difficult topic to broach. There's a danger of being misunderstood that you're somehow exculpating people for doing things when they were drunk, but that's not your point. This has to do with performative masculinity in the German army and other groups of perpetrators. This has to do with ritualistically putting oneself into a headspace, if that's the right word. Can you talk a little bit about that research, which is also something that you've been working on so recently?
Yeah, so one of the things, if historians mentioned alcohol in the literature, it was normally a very short kind of sentence or maybe a paragraph, and the common bumper sticker would have been alcohol was needed for coping by the perpetrators. However, when I really started looking at survivor testimony, at witness testimony, it was clear, as you kind of alluded to, that many of the perpetrators, for example, celebrated with alcohol. They didn't go back to the
Mhm.
bars and drink themselves kind of blotto and put their heads down on the bar and say, "Woe is me! I'm stuck here in the East doing these terrible things." In fact, they went back, they played games, they sang, they ate. In some cases, they set up food tables and alcohol at the killing sites, which one has to imagine what the sound, the smell would be like, what you would look like over the course of being involved in this kind of very up close and personal shooting. And it became clear to me that in fact, to get to some of the perpetrator attitudes, their behaviors and their actions became very clear. And using, as I said, witness testimony. So I'll give you just one example that was one of those kind of eureka moments for me. It was Horbansprach, or this Yiddish language of destruction, in which Yiddish communities in Eastern Europe create a language to talk about the perpetrators and what they're seeing. And one of the expressions that came out of seeing the perpetrators in action was this idea of a wedding atmosphere. And the eureka moment that I had with respect to that was, if you think in a small Jewish community in the East, what would have been one of the single most important days of the year, joyous days? Well, it would be a wedding, because there'd be food, there'd be music, there'd be drink, there would be dancing, there would be, a time for real enjoyment. And so as I thought about that, I thought about how the victims are watching the perpetrators, and they're looking for a language that describes how the perpetrators are acting. And the language that they found was the wedding atmosphere.
Mhm.
And, I can't climb into the heads of those perpetrators, but those witnesses and what they tell me they saw and how they interpreted, that's as close as I can get to really looking at what those perpetrators were feeling and doing in that moment. And unfortunately, I have lots of horrific examples in the book, including perpetrators who, on holidays like New Year's Eve, they would be celebrating, and then they would decide after midnight what did they want to do the first thing to kick off the new year. They went into the ghettos and hunted Jews, right? So again, for those perpetrators, I certainly understand what some of their ideas were, because that's how they wanted to start the year. They made a conscious decision that that was something that they wanted to do. So again, one of those a very horrific topic in many ways, but a topic I think that enabled us as historians to kind of move beyond a simple answer of coping, which for many of us felt safe, because we want to think that human beings, the only way they can become involved in these kinds of activities is we want them to be like us in that way. We want them to think that, yeah, I'd have to drink in order to do. That's the only way I could do it. And we find that that's really not the case.
Ed, you mentioned the book, and I should just say for those watching that the book is titled Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, which has won a prize from Yad Vashem, their book award. Ed, if I ask you to reflect, you talk about being involved in this field for 30 years. How do you think that the field of Holocaust studies has changed since you became centrally involved with it in the early 90s? And where do you think it's going?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a question I've thought a lot about and talked to different people about. Danny Green, who I met for
Hmm.
coffee in the department, and Peter Hayes, who's a friend of mine. We've talked about this among others. Um, I think there's a feeling that the kind of halcyon days, if you will, of Holocaust studies, the 1990s, this boom in the early 2000s, lots of programs being established, and Zev, as I talked about earlier, was really key to that, and the Holocaust Educational Foundation was key to that. I think with the loss of the survivor generation, as we've seen, we always have thought, what if we lose the voice? What's that going to mean? I think that has an impact. I think also we've seen a shift to the broader field of genocide studies. In that case, a more kind of global look at genocide has been part of that. Um, for me, the Holocaust was never just about the specifics of the experience of the destruction of the European Jews and other groups. It was a question about humanity. And when I had an earlier interview for the Holocaust Museum at one time, I think that what I said in that interview was something to the effect is, in some way, we all stood on those ramps at Auschwitz, at those selection ramps. And I believe that's the case. And so I think, that the place of Holocaust studies is still an important topic for us.
Mhm.
I think it's like all topics, however, right? It requires the expertise and commitment. And so, are there faculty who are interested in doing that and making that commitment? That's a huge thing. And I think there's broader issues with respect to the profession in general. If the halcyon days of Holocaust studies are behind us, the halcyon days of tenure and of most history departments are also behind us. And public regionals, for example, experience that much more greatly, I think, than somewhere like Northwestern. I think that Northwestern is one of those universities that will still be on the barricades long after others have abandoned them or they've been torn down. So I do think that as a profession, we're in a situation where hard choices have to be made about lines and about what's taught,
Yes.
and that's going to be a continued pressure, over the course of the next decade or two, I think.
You mentioned the halcyon days of kind of institutional centrality and a heroic generation of scholars in the 90s, and yet you are an example of how much is still being done even in the last couple of years, so that we need people to keep working on these topics. And so, if you had words of wisdom for students and emerging scholars, maybe close with what would those be?
Yeah, I appreciate that question a lot because I think some of the things, whether it's alcohol or dehydration and thirst, I think can be applied to other contexts and other times, other genocides, other mass atrocities. So that's one thing. I think that the insights we gain from working in our own field, if we're able to look at the literature from others, the way we do comparative, for example, history allows us to see new questions, ask new questions of ourselves. And I think also for me, it's always been, when I was a cadet at the Air Force Academy and studying history, people ask me, why are you studying history? You should be studying aerospace studies or aerospace engineering or astrodynamics. And the point was that I loved history. And so the thing I would say on that is we can be too utilitarian sometimes in
Yeah.
thinking about the choices we make. And I'm not saying that it's not important to think in terms of some utility, but also I think following those things that we find most interesting, that we find most enjoyable, understanding that there are trade-offs in that. You're not going to become wealthy as a public regional history professor, but there's wealth in other terms of the students you touch and the lives you change, maybe, and also the contributions eventually you hopefully make. So I think that that's the thing. Be happy in what you're doing. There's still many topics out there. And if you find one that coincides with your lived experience and you want to explore, then that's what I would suggest people do.
I can't improve upon that, Ed. So I think with that, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Well, thank you, Robin.
And
It's
just say
been
how much I've enjoyed being your colleague.
Yeah, it's great having you next door, except when you're playing like your bass guitar. Other than that, it's been great.
You're on to me. Thank you, Ed.